Thank you, Torrin. I'm going to read today from John's Gospel, chapter 8, and verse 30. John's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 30. As he spake these words, many believed on him. Then Jesus said to those Jews which believed on him, "If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed." Next verse says, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Next verse says, "They answered him, We be Abraham's seed, and were never in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, you shall be made free?" Verse 34, Jesus answered them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. And the servant," verse 35 says, "abideth not in the house forever, but the Son abideth forever." Verse 36, "If the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed." Now, this is an interesting passage, and there's lots of things to observe about it. First thing I want to call your attention to is something that you might have not noticed, or if you did, it might not have been important to you, or you might have thought it's a trivial thing to pay attention to. But sometimes these little things catch my attention. In this passage I just read to you, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but Jesus used the word indeed twice. Back in verse 31, Torrin, if you can put that up there. Verse 31 said, "Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on him, If you continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed." That's the first one. And then the verse we finished on, Torrin, if you could jump down to verse 36 and put that up. "If the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed." Now, reading in English, in an English translation as we are, those are the same word. And here's something interesting, and I don't think it's just trivia, but those two words that are translated indeed, which are words that we really don't pay any attention to. That's just like colorful words, we just would read right over that. Of course, what we're reading is English, but it was translated from the Greek language. And you can, if you want to, you can look up the Greek words that are behind the English words from which the English words are translated. And it's kind of interesting when you do that, because you discover some things that you might not have been aware of. In a translation, sometimes it flattens out differences and makes everything the same. But actually, in reality, there are two very different Greek words translated indeed. It's translated indeed twice, but it's two different words that are used. The first one, back in verse 31, when Jesus said to those Jews which believed on him, "If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed." The Greek word is alethos, which means something that is true as opposed to being false. Or in other words, it's something that you might assert and it's true as opposed to being not true. Of course, we can understand that, and you are my disciples, not just professing, but you really are. The other word, though, when you come down to verse 36, he says, "If the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed." A different Greek word is used. This time it's ontos. Now, ontos is an interesting word, and it means something a little stronger than alethos. It means something that you are, not something you profess, or not something that you claim to be, and it's true, like alethos is, "You're my disciples indeed." But this means something that you are in the core of your being. It has to do with what you be, if I could say it that way. It's the word from which in philosophy, like if you became a philosophy major at college, you would study different branches of philosophy, and one of those is called ontology, and it comes from this word, and it's the examination of what is really true. And that's what this word is. And it's a different word than the one used before. It means to be. It comes from a root word meaning to be. It's about your being, who you be, what you be. In other words, your identity. Not just something you profess, but something you are. Here's a way you could paraphrase this verse and bring out this word and emphasize what it means. If the Son frees you, your freedom will be real freedom, not apparent, not superficial freedom, not partial freedom, not freedom in name only. You will be free in the deepest, most real sense of your actual being. Now that's what Jesus said in conjunction with, if the Son shall make you free, you will be free right from the very core of your being. Now, that's a really interesting concept and interesting thought. Let's just back up from this passage and observe the main point. The main point is to be free. Jesus is talking about us, or those who believe on him, the object, the outcome that he's looking for. Not that we would trade masters. In other words, he doesn't say, now you're going to be my slave. He says you're going to be free. Now, of course, we do willingly submit to him and serve him and want to please him. But he says, I want you to be free. And I am going to make you free in the core of your being. Now, notice that being free, he's pretty clear about this. It's not something that we are expected to do, not something his listeners are expected to do for themselves, but something he says he is going to accomplish. It's not a task for us to complete. It's not something we have to struggle with or strenuously strive. I think, in talking to some Christians, I get the impression that they have a concept of Christianity that it's that we are engaged in a life and death struggle against sin, that we are striving and struggling. That's not what Jesus says here. In fact, that's the opposite of what he says. He says, well, it's interesting what he says about it. Torrin, could you, let's just pick out a few little things here. Verse 34. When they said to him, by the way, they said, what do you mean, be free? We're Abraham's seed. We've never been in bondage to anyone. And then he explains what he's talking about. Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. Now, don't read it backwards. You know what some people would do with this is bang you on the head with it and say, you better not commit a sin, because if you do, that'll make you the servant of sin. He's not saying that. He's saying just the opposite. He said the reason people commit sin is because they are the servants of sin. In other words, here's another way to say it. Jesus has come on the scene into this world to set us free, and the condition that he finds humanity in is in slavery or in bondage. And his goal is to set everyone free, at least those who believe on him. That's who we're talking about here. At the very beginning, it said, as he spoke these words, many believed on him, and his object is to make everybody free. He didn't say you better get free. He didn't say you've got to do it. He says, I will make you free. Now, verse 30, see, the question might arise then, well, how does he do it? How is it accomplished? Because, is he just going to go around one-on-one, and talk to people, or exactly how is he going to accomplish this? Well, he actually tells us in this passage. The verse I started with, Torrin, I'm sorry to make you jump around, Torrin. I'm kind of jumping around and reading this out of order. Verse 30, this is the one I started with. Verse 30 says, as he spake these words, many believed on him. And by the way, I like to point out whenever I come across this, that in John's Gospel especially, he uses this construction of words, which sometimes might strike us a little strange. He says, as he spoke these words, many believed on him. You know, now you might think, well, that's odd. Why do you say believe on? Why doesn't he say believed in him? That's how we say it just in our common talk. Again, it gets back to the words that are used in the Greek language. And again, I'm not a Greek scholar, by the way. Let me just tell you that. But you can find these things out. There are books. And, before we had the internet, I'm so old that I remember the days before the internet. And some of you remember that too. And so when I used to study the Bible to begin with, I had a big old fat book. It's about this thick. It's called Strong's Concordance. And you can look up every single word in the King James translation, and then it tells you a little number by it, and then you turn to the back. It's very tedious, very cumbersome, and the words are about the size of ants' footprints, and you have to get a magnifying glass, and it was really a lot of trouble, but I used to do that. I went through it, and I'd look up all the words and see what the definitions are and how they're used, and then you can study further once you know what it is. You can find out how it was used. It's kind of a pain in the neck to do it that way, but that's the only way we had it. But now with the internet, you've got Strong's Concordance online. Much faster, better use of my time. I can type in the word and it brings it up immediately. I can click on all the different definitions. I can explore how it was used in Greek culture apart from the New Testament. Lots of good study tools is what I'm saying. And you find interesting things. And in the process of looking into some of these words and how they're used, I discovered that John's Gospel, John likes to use this expression, believed on him. And the reason is the word that is translated believe carries a slightly different word. Again, our English translations sort of flatten it out. But it's deeper if you look into what the word behind it is. The Greek word that's used to translate as believe here, it implies something other than just mental acknowledgement. It means that something that you trust in or put your weight on or lean on. That's really what it comes from, an idea that you're leaning on something. And so that's why the translators put it this way. They believed on him. You could say it this way, in the sense of what they're trusting in, they put their weight on him instead of on themselves. That's what it means to believe on him, means instead of me standing on my own 2 feet, now I'm leaning on him. Instead of me trusting in myself, now I'm trusting in him. And that's the right reaction, you see. That is really, as far as the human side of this equation goes, that is really the only thing that he wants from us. That's the only thing he's looking for. That's all. To lean on him or throw your weight on him or trust in him instead of on yourself. Now, I'll come back to that. That's why I like that it says that. I like to point that out, that this is what's expected of us, that we quit trusting in ourselves, quit trying to be good enough, quit trying to, I hope I've done enough good things, avoided enough bad. That's what we think. It's all on us. He's saying, no, it's all on me. He said, I'm the son. In that passage we just read, he said, the servant abides not in the house forever. What does that mean? That means the servant is in a status where you're in an insecure position. A servant can be dismissed at any time. That's what he's saying. But the son never can be dismissed, and the son has authority to set the servants free. And he says, if I set you free, then you're going to be free in the core of your being. You're going to be actually free, not something that you profess or not something that you tell somebody. And it's certainly not something you do. But notice this in verse 30. It said, as he spoke these words. What words? Well, let's find out, because this is where he explains how it is that he is going to accomplish this, what it is that he's going to do that makes us free. And notice that he said to those who believed on him, continue in my word. Why does he say that, by the way? Continue in my word. Well, let's hold that thought and let's go back and see what he just said. Go back to verse 28. we're going to back up and get the 2 verses prior to when he said, the text said, as he spoke these words. Here are the words that he spoke that caused them to believe on him. Verse 28 says, then Jesus said to them, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then shall you know that I am he, that is the Son of Man. And that I do nothing of myself, but as my Father hath taught me, I speak these things. Now when he says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, you shall know that I am he. I am he means the Son of Man. Why does he call himself that? In the Jewish belief system, the expectation, the prophetic books in the Jewish scripture, what we call the Old Testament, especially in Daniel, the figure that they were expecting, that they regarded as the Messiah, was sometimes called the Son of Man. That means he's a man, but he's got a special status. And all these things were predicted in Daniel about the Son of Man, and it had to do with the apocalyptic belief system and the end and the setting of things right. The Son of Man will come and set things right. And here he is adopting this phraseology referring to himself. So that's one thing. He said, you'll know that I am he. That is, I am the Son of Man that you are expecting. But then it says something kind of mysterious to them, not mysterious to us, because we're looking back. They were standing there in his presence, and he said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man. Now, I think we understand what that means. He means on the cross. Now, they didn't know anything about the cross. They didn't especially know that that was part of the plan. They didn't know anything about it. They were totally in the dark concerning that. We are not, because we have the rest of the New Testament, and especially the things that Paul has written. So we know when he says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, he's talking about lifted up on the cross. Now there's a reason why they were in the dark, and they were kept in the dark. There's a reason why he didn't explain it. Paul tells us, this is the thing about it. Paul reveals a lot of things that in the Gospels he couldn't reveal. And Paul tells us, this is in 1 Corinthians in chapter 2. Paul says, if the princes of this world would have known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. In other words, he's talking about the principalities and powers and those fallen angels that enforce, the fallen condition of mankind. Because of sin, they're able to rule over mankind, and they've got that position because of their prior status. And Paul's saying if they would have known what was about to happen, they wouldn't have done it. That's what he means. And so Jesus can't tell. It was kept secret. Paul also calls it a mystery, something hidden in God until it was accomplished. But here Jesus is intimating for them. He says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you're going to know that that's me. And that's why he says, if you continue in my word, you're going to find out the truth. And when you find out the truth, he said, the truth will make you free. Remember, the object is to be free. And he said, I'm the Son, and I'm going to set you free. But it has to do with you finding out the truth. And here he says, the key to it, or let's just say it this way, how it's accomplished is the lifting up of the Son of Man. This expression is also found elsewhere in this gospel. And let's just turn back and read it. This will give us a more clear view of it. It's in John's gospel in chapter 3. And Torrin, it's John chapter 3, verse 14. Now, before I read, let me give you the background. In this chapter, a Pharisee, and these were the class of people, number one, they were the strictest observers of the law of Moses. Number two, they felt like they were more holy than anyone else. And number three, they were the enemies of Jesus, the Pharisees were. They were very religious, very strict in their manner of life, and they really resented and hated Jesus. They plotted and conspired with the temple authorities and with the Romans to put him to death. That's how much they hated him. Yet here was a man named Nicodemus in chapter 3, one of the Pharisees, who sensed that there might be more to this Jesus than what they were, what they assumed about him. So by night, secretively, so no one would know, he came to Jesus secretly at night, and he said, we know, this is interesting, he said this, we know you've come from God. Nevertheless, they wanted to kill him. They said, we know you've come from God because no one can do the things you're doing. Good observation, right? You can't go around opening the eyes of the blind and making the lame walk and say the things that he's saying and do the things that he's doing. They could tell he is not an ordinary person. And Jesus had a little conversation with him about that. And we don't want to take time to read the whole thing right now. So that's the context there. But in the midst of this conversation, he said something to this Pharisee who was leaning towards, he doesn't say he believed in him, or on him, but it sounds like he's leaning that direction. Jesus gave him a lot of good information here. In fact, this is the very passage where we get the famous verse, John 3:16, in this conversation, Jesus with this Pharisee who is sort of opening his heart to Jesus in a way. But look at what Jesus says in verse 14. 2 verses, by the way, right before John 3:16 that everybody knows. But John 14 says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Now, do you get the same connection to what he said back in chapter 8? Exact same expression. But now he makes a comparison. And he says, just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Now, Jesus knew that this Pharisee, very well acquainted with the Old Testament, knew what that meant. Now, we, coming later, we might not everybody that might have a clear picture of what that meant when Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. So let me explain it. It's found in Numbers, by the way. We're not going to turn and read that right now, but let me just tell it to you to save time. The children of Israel were on the way to the Promised Land. God had delivered them from Egypt, and as they're on their way to the Promised Land, they got discouraged. Easy to do, we can identify with them. They got discouraged and they said, there's no food, there's no water. And they complained and they murmured, it said. They complained against Moses, they complained against God. And they said things like, we wish we were back in Egypt, and would to God that we had died in Egypt. They were really discouraged and they said a lot of bad things they shouldn't have said. And the text says, because of what they did and what they said, it says, fiery serpents came among them and began to bite the people, and they began to die. And this caught their attention, and they went to Moses, and they said, Moses, we have sinned against God and against you, and please go pray to God and tell him to take away the fiery serpents from killing us. You see the system here. You might think, if we were just going to analyze it and put ourselves in this position, you might think what it would say next is that God would say, you bunch of backslidden buzzards, no wonder that, you're dying, it's because of what you did. And it's your fault, and you better, do something, to rectify. It's your sins that caused this. And it was. And no doubt about it. And they admitted it. They said, we've sinned, and there's no getting around it. But here's what God told Moses. Not for them to do something about it. In other words, we might expect God to say, you caused this problem, you get out of it, Get yourself a stick, and fight it. You get in a struggle against this sin, against these snakes. The snakes represent the sin, right? Can we understand that kind of symbolism? You need to struggle and strive, and it's your fault anyway. And he didn't tell him that. It's kind of amazing. He didn't tell him to do anything. He told Moses, he said, I want you to make a serpent out of brass and put it on a pole and lift it up before the people. And everyone who looks at that serpent on the pole will be healed. Amazing. He didn't tell them to do anything except look at that serpent on the pole. Very much like what Jesus said. He said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, you'll know I am he. Here he says to Nicodemus, Just like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. You see, the serpent in the wilderness was God's method of rectifying their sin or setting them free from that situation that was caused by their sins. And here he says, I'm going to do the same thing. Now, he's hinting about it, I'm sure not crystal clear. For us, it's pretty clear, Now, here's the point. When we were talking about John chapter 8, and he said, if the Son sets you free, you're going to be free in the very core of your being. And the reason he told them to continue in my word is because the reality of what he was going to do was not yet revealed. And they needed to stay hooked up and plugged in to him as his disciples, because after it was done, then they would find out. Then he said, the truth that you find out will set you free. Now, for them, they had to continue in his word so they could find out something that wasn't yet done. It wasn't yet a reality. But for us, listen to this. It is now an accomplished fact. It is a fixed and finished reality for us. Christians are not the servants of sin. No Christian is. And I would tend to think that, I would go a little further and say nobody is. Now, this creates some issues or some questions. But let's just stick with this idea. Jesus has already accomplished this action, and he has set us free in reality. It's now a tangible reality. We are not the slaves of sin. It's as though, let's picture if we were slaves in America before the Civil War, if we were Africans that had been kidnapped from Africa and made slaves in the United States, and then the Civil War is fought and the 13th Amendment is passed, and now we are no longer slaves on the plantation. We shouldn't be anymore thinking about the plantation, because that life on the plantation is over. We shouldn't be thinking about that. Shouldn't govern our thinking, and we should have a new way of thinking about things. Now, please notice something here. Torrin, would you turn to a passage for me? Hebrews chapter 8, verse 12. First, notice this. This is Hebrews chapter 8, verse 12. This is quoting from Jeremiah, and this writer to the Hebrews is, and I'm just jumping in here in the middle of his argument, but I just want to get this thought. For I will be merciful. This is God talking now through the prophet Jeremiah. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. And by the way, he's talking about making a new covenant. He's talking about the provisions and the reality of the new covenant. And this is one of them. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and iniquities I will remind them of every day. No, it doesn't say that, does it? It says their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. Well, here's my thought. If God doesn't remember them, why should we? Well, seriously. If God's not thinking about, remember means something in your remembrance, in your thinking about it. If God's not taking it into account or thinking about it, we should not either. We shouldn't be thinking that way. God doesn't. He doesn't want to hear about it anymore. As far as he's concerned, he has already lifted up Jesus on the cross, and there is where the business was transacted. There's where the punishment was meted out. As far as he's concerned, it's over. And those of us, especially those of us who, I was about to say, who profess to believe in him, I guess I'm going to say, who claim to believe in him, what I've observed is that, Christians claim to believe that Jesus died for our sins. But in reality, when I talk to many of them, I find out they don't really believe that, because they still think that it's still we who have to deal with it. I remember, and I'll give you a little illustration here. I've told this before. I remember walking out of a church one time with a man who attended a different church, and we were meeting together at a men's meeting called Promise Keepers, and had a lot of discussion, and trying to be better men. That's what it was for, try to be better fathers, better men, all that. And so we're walking out of this meeting, and I don't know if the man was talking to me, trying to respond to something he heard me say, or if he's just blurted something out. But this other gentleman said, just right out loud, walking next to me, he said, I know we've all got to pay for what we've done. And I thought to myself, well, if that's true, then Jesus was wasting his time. Jesus died for nothing, If we've all got to pay for what we've done, then Jesus' death is meaningless. I don't know if you ever considered that or not. His death was pointless. It was to no avail. As far as God's concerned, Jesus paid for what we've done. Now, as I have considered that little moment in my life, I tend to think more and more he was trying to, get the last word in on me, because, I think the things that we're talking about here, for some Christian, it rubs them the wrong way. They've got a mentality shaped by the church, big church, big, not just church, but the church world. The church world doesn't really have this mindset that we just read here. Their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. Let me just tell you how it works. In the church world, you're not free. In fact, here's how it works. Here's the motivation. It's called the carrot and the stick. This is a way you manipulate and train animals. This is the way you might treat a donkey or a horse. And the idea of the carrot and the stick is you suspend a carrot out in front of the animal. That's a reward. And that makes them move forward because they want the reward. And if they aren't moving good enough, then you take a stick and hit them on the rear end to motivate them. So one is a promise of a reward if you go forward, and then the threat of punishment on the other side. So a promise of reward and the threat of punishment. The thing of it is, though, you can never give them the carrot, because then they'll cease to move forward in this approach. So it's a false promise, ultimately, but they don't know it's false. So that's the way the church world works. It manipulates people by promising them some afterlife reward. They can't ever tell them that they've got it. You ought to keep them insecure and say, well, you might get it. And then threaten them with hell behind and an angry God. So you're threatened with fear on one side and the promise of reward if you keep moving. But you've never really got it. That's how it works. That's how people are motivated. This is not Christianity, though. That's not what I'm describing. That was opposite of Christianity. What Christianity really, what Christ is make you free. Throw away the carrot, throw away the stick, and now you're free. Well then, if you throw away the carrot and you throw away the stick, what's going to motivate you? Well, let's talk about that. Last Sunday night, this just comes to mind. As you know, because I talk about it all the time, I get some good illustrations, though, from this, but I go out to BJCC and have a prison service. And sometimes I have some interesting conversations. Now, I have to say, most of the time, nobody has to go to the church services. They don't make them go. And they come because they want to. And I do have some, men that like what I say, and it's been helpful for them. I hear from some of them afterwards, and they get a hold of it. They get a glimmer of the truth, and they find that it's helpful. And that's the whole point, I think, is to be helpful. But every now and then I get somebody who's indoctrinated in church thinking and really, really gets hostile, And so I had one of those last week, and this guy was trying to argue with me about it, and he didn't like what I was saying, and he let me know that. And he said, no, we have to be obedient, And he said to me, I only try to do those things that please my Father. And I almost laughed. I said, yeah, sure you do, Jesus can say that, but you and me can't say that. And he said, well, okay, you, for example, meaning me. He said, I told him I've been coming out there for all these years, 30 years really I've been going out there. It seems like a long time now. Everything seems like a long time. By the way, this is off the subject, but when we first got married, April and I, when we first got married, when our anniversary would come around, people would say, "Oh, how long have you been married?" And I used to make a little joke. I said, "Well, I don't know, but it seems like 50 years." But now it's no joke. But anyway, so I'd mentioned that, how long I've been coming out there. And he says, "Well, you've been coming out here all this time." And he said, "You wouldn't be coming out here unless you were trying to please the Father, unless you were, trying to be obedient to what God wants you to do." And I said, "No, that's not right. That is not true. That's not why I go out there. You know why I go out there? Because I want to. Because I want to. It never crosses my mind to be obedient. It never crosses my mind that my Father is..." See, that's slave thinking. I'm free. I go because I want to. I'm free to do the right thing. I'm free to do the right thing because I want to do the right thing. Now, I noticed in this passage we read from John chapter 8, Jesus said, "If you continue in my word, then you are my disciples in reality, and then you're going to know the truth, and the truth will make you free." Now, actually, I never want to lose touch with how I felt when I first started out as a Christian, because I didn't know then what I know now. But after continuing in his word, I became more free. And now I do the right thing, not because I'm afraid, but back then I remember I was kind of like that guy, with all of his line of BS and nonsense. "Oh, I only try to do those things that please my Father, That's just a bunch of fluff. And, as soon as he's not in a prison environment, that's all going to go out the window. That's not, if that were the case, then Jesus wouldn't say, "The Son it's got to be me, the Son, who sets you free." If it were up to us and our strenuous moral striving, Jesus wouldn't need to come on the scene anyway, you see. But I don't want to lose touch with how I felt. In the beginning, I was scared, I was frightened. I thought, here's my concept of Christianity, that I had been admitted to an exclusive club, and one false step and I was liable to be kicked out, like I was walking on a tightrope, and very conscious of sin, and everything seemed wrong, and part of the trouble is, part of our problem is we grow up in an environment, we're in a churchy environment where the church defines pretty much everything as sin, I remember when I was in Bible school, I heard Kenneth Hagin tell this story. He said he was at a convention with a bunch of ministers talking. He overheard a conversation, and one minister said to another one, "Brother, is it a sin to drink coffee?" And the other one said, "Well, I don't know, but if you give it up, God will bless you for it." Now, yeah, you're supposed to laugh at that. That's meant to. Isn't that silly? Here's another story like that. This reminds me of another one. That was a Kenneth Hagin story. Here's an Andrew Wommack story. You may know who Andrew Wommack is. He's got a television program. But he said in one of his, he was invited to speak in Europe. And so he traveled, I forget, France, I think, in Europe. But he was having a meal with the ministers there. And they served wine with the meal. And he was horrified by that because he was brought up as a Southern Baptist. And alcohol, you might as well sign your soul to the devil. That is like a big sin. And he was staring at that glass of wine and trying to figure out, well, should I drink it so I don't offend them? But I can't drink that because I've never touched alcohol in my life, and I was brought up that that's a sin. And while he's pondering that in his mind, one of the ministers, the European minister sitting next to him, he leaned over and whispered to him, he says, "I've heard that in the States people drink coffee." Now, he didn't think anything about drinking wine because in their culture, no one thinks anything of it. You see, part of our problem is in our puritanical Christian so-called culture, we define pretty much everything as sin. A lot of trivial things that have no consequence whatsoever. We make everything a sin. while I'm telling minister stories, I remember another man. I'm not going to mention his name, but he was a little bit overweight, and he used that as an illustration. He said, I was brought up in a Pentecostal denomination that puts the word holiness on the end of their name because they believe they were more strict and more holy than anybody else. And he was brought up with the idea that you can't wear shorts. If you wear shorts, that's immoral, And so when he went to school and they had gym class and you had to have shorts, he said, well, I can't do it because, that's a sin. Well, he said, that's why I'm overweight today, because I never had gym class. But that was his story. But, what I'm saying to you is we imagine a lot of things in our mind, a lot of trivial things having to do with food or with what you drink or anything you take into your body. We make it out like certain things are sin. Now, there are some pragmatic reasons to do some things, not other things, but that's just up to you. You're free, is what I'm saying. What I'm getting at is we're not supposed to be self-conscious and like we're walking on eggshells. And again, I never want to lose touch with what it felt like. To not know anything and to be victimized by a church system that makes everything into a sin, where you felt like, one false step and you're liable to be thrown out. Torrin, could you put up here Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 for a second? Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 says this. Here, I'll just turn to it so I don't have to turn around and read off that. I just get lazy and read it out. You can read that. I'm going to read it out of my Bible. Okay. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 says this. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of those things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year make the comers thereunto perfect. In other words, he's saying that in the days of the Old Testament law, in a national Israel governed by the law, there were under the law sacrifices for sin. And they offered them continually, he says. But he says those sacrifices couldn't ever do the job, or they couldn't ever bring the worshipers to a state of completion, if I can say it that way. Why? Verse 2 says this. For then would they not have ceased to be offered? In other words, if they did the job, if they did what they were purporting to do, they were sacrifices for sin, you see. And he said if they actually did it, if they purged or purified or set the worshipers free, to use the language we've been using, would they then not have ceased to be offered? Because, listen, the worshipers, once purged, should have no more conscience of sins. Do you understand what he's getting at? He's saying if a sacrifice could come and take away sins, then you wouldn't have to offer it anymore. Well, that's, of course, talking, if you go on reading, he makes it explicit. That's talking about the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, where he took our sins into his own body and there dealt with them and paid for them and was punished on our behalf. And so the question of sin was settled once and for all forever in the body of Jesus. So he says, first of all, if it did the job, it doesn't have to be offered anymore. But secondly, the worshipers, that's us by the way, once purged. Now who did the purging? Well, he did on the cross. His sacrifice. We are those who believe in him. We are those who believe in his sacrifice. We are those who trust in him and what he did. We are those who are purged. And now it says that we are the worshipers, have no more conscience of sins. In other words, we're not supposed to be thinking about sin all the time. We're not supposed to be conscious of it. This sounds so contrary, I know, to what we think of as traditional Christianity. Let me put it in a more positive kind of a comparison. Let's consider Adam and Eve. God made the creation. We read about it in Genesis. And everything he made, he said it is good. If you read Genesis chapter 1 about God creating the physical creation, you never do find where he said, well, that's good, but over here this is not good. It's all good. It was his creation. Of course it's good, you know. And then at the very end, on the last day of creation, he made man. By that I mean mankind. And, you know, the story of it, there's Adam and then there's Eve, and we know, that whole story. But so he's got Adam and Eve, and they're in a garden. Where'd that garden come from? Did Adam and Eve create the garden? No, God created the garden. God made a beautiful garden. Everything they needed was provided for them. Do you think that Adam and Eve walked around through that garden? And, well, I can tell you that they were not conscious of sin. There was no conception in their minds of that. Everything was good. They were not self-conscious either. You know how I know they weren't self-conscious? Because the minute they disobeyed God, the very one thing he told them stay away from is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when they were tempted by the serpent and took the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and as he said, he was right about that, their eyes were opened. But their eyes were open to the wrong thing. Suddenly they became self-conscious instead of God-conscious. God and his love conscious. See, before, we don't really know what they did. It doesn't tell us what they did in the garden. It just said God came down in the cool of the day and walked with them. We don't know what went on other than that. They had fellowship or companionship or friendship with God. They were God-conscious. And they were not self-conscious. And the reason I know that is the minute they disobeyed and ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it says the eyes of them both were open. And what did they know? They knew that they both were naked. They became self-conscious of their own deficiencies. And it separated them from God. It said they went away and hid in the bushes. God came in the cool of the day just like nothing had happened. Do you think he didn't know? I think he did know. It didn't, as far as he was concerned, cause a separation on his end. It caused a separation on their end. They hid themselves. They hid themselves in the bushes because God said, Adam, where are you? And he says, I hid myself because I was afraid. That never happened before. I was naked and I hid myself. And he says, who told you? That's kind of funny, isn't it? They were not self-conscious. You see, I think this is what it's getting at when the writer to the Hebrews said, the worshipers, once purged, should have no more consciousness of sins. We're not supposed to be self-conscious. We're not supposed to be studying our lives under a microscope, looking for all the faults and the flaws. We're supposed to live, kind of like Adam and Eve. Just walk with God, go through your day, and enjoy God's company. And like I said, when I was talking to that guy at the prison who said, you do these things because you come out here because you're trying to please God. I'm not trying to please God. I come because I want to. When I do the right thing, I don't even think about it. I do because I want to. Now, this is not to say we're perfect. This is not to say we never do anything wrong. But, hey, Torrin, go back to Hebrews chapter 8 just a second. You know that other verse 12? Hebrews chapter 8, verse 12. See, it's not to say that we never do anything wrong. It's not to say we're perfect. Not to say that we sometimes get short with somebody or spout off or say something we shouldn't say we're not, as long as you're in a physical body, there's the potential for failure. Look at what this says again. This is so interesting what it says. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and iniquities I will remember no more. So if it's a sin, it's I don't remember it anymore. But if it's a failure of some kind, I'll be merciful to that. I think of it this way. Those of you who have been parents, you can identify with this. When a child is first born, it's sort of immobile, but then the baby begins to crawl a little bit, and then finally gets up on his 2 feet and begins to walk. Now, the general thing that happens is once that child gets up on his 2 feet and begins to walk, he falls down a time or two. Now, what does the parent do when that child fails and falls down? Well, as far as I know, and just based on my own experience, what do? Do you say, oh, I can't believe that. You're not my child anymore. Do you kick them out because of that? That would be so wrong and stupid, you know. No, as a parent, you know enough to say, come on, honey, try again. You can do it. That's what unrighteousness is. You see, it takes a while. It takes a while to grow into progressive degrees of, maturity. But God is like a loving father who never gives up on encouraging us. And as far as things that would ever disqualify us, like sins and iniquities, they're not remembered anymore. And we're not supposed to remember them either. We're not supposed to be self-conscious. We're supposed to be conscious only of the God who loves us and has made complete provision for us. And that's how we can live a stress-free, anxiety-free life and enjoy the life that we are living day to day and moment by moment. Okay, I think that's all we've got today. Anyone have any prayer requests before we go, or does anyone need prayer for anything? Thank you, Torrin, by the way.